Okay, our second in the series on what we're calling Gear Spotlight here at Blue Glow Electronics. Today we're going to focus on what is known as the AR Turntable. And before I dive into that, I've a couple things I'm trying to do with this Gear Spotlight series, trying to perfect it a little bit. So one thing I did is I created me a new PowerPoint template that, by the way, is HD compatible, so it actually fits the screen now. And two, that kind of walks through the same kind of thought processes on each of these gear spotlights. So we'll go through the gear itself, a little bit of history, some of the specs, some pros and cons, and if there are any typical mods that are seen done to this piece of gear, I'll kind of list those. So you'll get the same experience with each piece of gear. So let's dive on in. All right, you can see a few pictures here of the turntable in various states, and it's one of my favorite turntables of all time. I really like the kind of classic wood look with the polished aluminum platter and the acrylic lid. It's just it's one of my favorites. So let's dive on in. Okay, these things are made by Acoustic Research, otherwise known as AR, and that is not to be confused with Audio Research Corporation, otherwise known as ARC, that makes preamps and amplifiers. AR had not made a turntable in quite a few years, and so when they came back out with their turntable line, they officially called it the AR Turntable. It was kind of their relaunching of this name. And as you can see here in the upper right hand corner, kind of a picture of the predecessor to these tables, which was the ARAX and XA and XB. These were made back in the 60s, and a lot of people similar to these like to modify and kind of tweak those tables. And there are a lot of concepts that got borrowed from those original tables. The floating sub chassis being one of those, having an inner and outer platter being another. These things were introduced in late 83. Some people say 84, but I've found articles where these things were being reviewed at electronic shows in late 83. They originally came for $475 with a fixed head shell tone arm that was actually made. It was branded AR, but it was made by Gelco. Or you could get the table without the Gelco arm on it for $350. And you can kind of see a picture here of what that Gelco arm looks like. They were in Europe, they were called the Legend turntable instead of the AR turntable. I'm not sure why. And by 1985, several variations of this table had came out. One was titled the EB101, which had a little bit of a square plinth versus the rounded edges you will see on the turntable. And the EB101 also had a fixed arm. And this little black table I'm showing right here, you can see that it has a small hole here, and this arm is mounted then to the sub chassis. And so these are not as desirable because it's much harder, if not darn near impossible, to change the arm out on these units. There is a model called the ES1 that came for $475 with the arm, $350 without. It was an improved version of the EB101, and I have seen some strange variations of these two over the years as well. Like, I've seen what I think is a ES1 that doesn't have a fixed arm, that has a cutout, and I've seen versions of the EB101 that didn't have a fixed arm. So I'm not sure if they had been modified along the way, or someone had mixed up parts on turntables, or whether they actually came that way, but I've seen some weird variations. And then there's also a larger plinth turntable called the ES1. It's about $700. You don't see many of those at all out there. So the official AR turntable came in several veneered finishes, and they were all veneer over top of particle board. And you may think that's a bad thing. It's actually not. It gives some denseness to the plinth, and it's but yet still the beauty of a really nice veneered finish. They came in, as you can see here, kind of an old walnut as seen on the left here, kind of a cherry color in the middle here. Most of those came out of the UK, and then a lighter kind of maple color on some of these variations, as you can see here on the right. By the way, if you happen to have one of these and it's kind of beat up, scratched up, It's easy to strip these tables down to just the wood plinth and take it to a cabinet shop, somebody that does veneering, and get one of these things veneered. I've had a couple done. It cost you about $100. Okay, back in 1984, a guy named Peter Mitchell reviewed this thing in Audio Magazine, and it kind of set a fire on the industry out there. And there's a lot of other good articles out there on these things and reviews, but these things kind of took off in sales from there, and there were a lot of them sold. They were ultimately discontinued in 1987, so these things only lived about a 4-year life here being produced. But ever since then, they have been known as what I'll call a modder's table or a tweaker's table. It is a great platform to build upon and make a really super nice turntable out of these things. And a couple well-known modders over the years that have gotten a lot of fame in this space are a guy by the name of Mark Moran and Dave over at Vinyl Nirvana. I've interacted with Mark Moran a good bit. Really super nice guy, easy to deal with, and really knows his stuff. Maybe a little bit more of a machinist, so he's really good at bearings and spindles and whatnot on these things, the motors. Dave, I've only bought parts from him, so I can't say a whole lot there. I bought parts and they've shown up. That's about all I can say. Okay, these are kind of the factory rated specs on these things. It's a drive system, a one-step belt drive. It has a 24-pole synchronous motor, and by the way, that's at 300 RPMs. If you divide that 24 into 300, I think you end at about 12.5 hertz resonant frequency on this motor, which by the way is a little lower than the human ear could hear. A lot of turntables in this time frame had a resonant frequency high enough that people could actually hear it, so just helped with the overall dynamics of this turntable, this kind of new motor design. It does both 33 and 45 RPMs. 1.8 kilogram platter, uses a dampened 3-point suspension, sprung suspension. You can see here in this upper right hand corner, these 3 springs right here kind of mount to this upper plate here, and as you can see the bearing well here for the platter spindle, as it comes down into this, it puts weight on this sub chassis, and these springs kind of float this thing midair, so your tone arm and your platter are floating together. It's a absolutely phenomenal, marvelous design. Wow and Flutter, some really low numbers here, 0.04, and Rumble minus 73 dB, and these numbers can even be improved on greatly as these tables get modded. Some of the pros of this table, first off, I think they're a very sexy looking table. That's a subjective statement, as we all know, but a lot of people seem to like these. The thing I mentioned a minute ago, it truly has a floating sub chassis, so you can have one of these tables, and if the sub chassis is weighted properly, you can jump up and down in the room. You can tap on the table, the wood plinth. You can tap on the whatever you've got the table sitting on, and it never affects the platter or the tone arm. So really good in a room where you might have a lot of kids running around or vibrations from whatever else in the house. These things are kind of like I mentioned, a tweaker's dream table, easy modified and improved, many options out there. It's my personal opinion. I believe one of these done right can keep up with any $10,000 turntable out there, and that's just my personal belief system. Okay, and these things have most of them have a replaceable tone arm. Both the tone arm and the arm board are both replaceable, except for the ones that have the little hole, like the ES1 model. I'd be a little leery of those. They're not really a modifiable table as it comes to the tone arm. And I'm gonna list it here again. These things have a full floating subject. I can't tell you how important that is, and what that brings to the table as far as a really good turntable. But you'll hear in a minute there is a little bit of a downside to that. One of the pros, these things were available, until the past 5 years or so, for $200 to $300. I found them a lot on Craigslist, online forums. newspapers, whatnot. They have gotten much scarcer, and thus are bringing kind of higher prices. And I need to move that over. There you go. It's easy to find parts for these things. It's easy to find people that can service them. Parts are available on the used market. Vinyl Nirvana carries a lot of new parts as well, kind of parts that have been remanufactured. So even as the used parts dry up, there's a lot of new remanufactured parts out there. And there are multitudes of info, articles, and write-ups on the internet about these things. All right, some of the cons of these tables. Some of the early 1983, early 84 versions had a motor noise issue, and a new version of the motor got introduced in 1985. If you happen to get one of those, no fear, there are replacement motors available. You can find used ones on eBay. You can buy new ones from some of the people I've mentioned. They came with this factory Gelco arm, and Gelco's got a good name to it, but unfortunately, these developed both sticking issues on their kind of pivot as well as queuing issues. And back in the day, you could get a factory warranty replacement for the queuing mechanism, but those days are gone. I look at a downside. You have to remove the outer platter to kind of change the speed. So if you're playing on an LP and want to go play a 45, you kind of have to pull your slip mat off, and then you have to pull the outer platter off. You have to move the belt on the pulley system and then put it all back together. I mentioned the earlier models, the motor issues. The lid hinges, the springs in those are growing weak these days, and I will warn you, sometimes you will find where people are selling new old stock ones. Well, guess what? They've been sitting around forever. The springs are getting weak in those as well. So I've even bought two brand new ones before, got them, and they're not as strong as others I've seen. So I'll show you a fix for that in a little bit. You cannot easily use a record clamp or weight on these turntables. So you see people that have a little metal weight of some sort in the middle of their turntable to kind of hold the record down and kind of hold it flat. Well, that weight messes with the suspension balance and the kind of the floating point of that sub chassis. So really the only way around that is if you have to kind of weight the whole sub suspension with that weight on the table at the time you weight the sub suspension. The problem with that is a lot of people don't use weights when they play 45s, and then so your table isn't exactly floating if you're not using that weight on there properly. The factory particle arm board, and you can see a picture of it here on the right. It's kind of a black particle board. It will suck the life out of your tone arm. So you definitely, if you get one of these tables, want to replace that arm board on the right there. And I will say quality control / quality assurance on these things coming out of the factory was not always the greatest. It left some tables better than others. I've seen some where the bearing wells weren't made exactly perfectly, or the kind of this the platter itself that's a kind of a poured molten platter. I've seen imperfections in those. I've seen them where they're not balanced perfectly, various things. So some tables just out here are just better than others. Not that they can't be tweaked to get back in line, but some are just better than others. Okay, the next time I find an AR turntable that is completely unmodded, I'm going to make a video on that. So this would be kind of some of the steps I would go through. But I haven't found a good one in the last probably 2 years to buy to actually make a video since I've been making videos. If I come across one, I will. But prior to that, it seems like I was finding them all the time. But a couple things that are commonly known, typical mods for these. A lot of people will replace the factory tone arm with a Lin Basic or even higher end Lin tone arm on these things. They work out really well. They will replace the factory arm board with a very dense exotic hardwood like olive wood, cocobolo, lacewood, rosewood, etc. They will replace the tone arm cables. I will warn you, mounting and routing of these cables affects the floating subchassis somewhat, depending on how you mount them, so pay attention. You got to be careful not to get them in a bind or whatnot. You would typically replace the start and run motor capacitors on the circuit board. You would typically add weight and spin balance the motor pulley. Typically they're about 80 some grams. You want to get them up to about 300 grams. Typically you'll see the motor's clean, the bushings reset and lubricated. You'll see the platter spindle kind of cleaned, polished, and lubricated. If you got the right kind of machine shop, you could actually balance the platter. That might be a little more than your average DIYer at your home. And then this is the big one. Most people replace the sub chassis springs with a Lin black spring set. You can order them brand new from Lin out of the UK. Get new rubber grommets that come along with that. But doing that, these springs are heavier and stiffer than the original factory springs. Doing this requires you to re-weight the sub chassis, typically around 2.5 pounds you have to add to this thing. And you typically want to replace the belt. By the way, get you a bag, a Ziploc bag, get some talc, put it in that Ziploc bag, talc powder. Drop your belt into that bag, shake it up, pull your belt out, shake it off, then put it on your turntable. You will get much better results with some talc on these. That secret I told you I was going to tell you about, add a third hinge in the very middle. If done properly, no one would ever notice it. I probably had 50 people look at my table over the years, and it's the one I use all the time, and no one's ever said to me, "Wow, you added a third hinge in the middle there." So it's a little trick I learned along the way. Easily to polish the outer platter, and I made a video on how to do that. You can go find it. This is tips I got from Mark Morin one time, how he does his finishes. He strips the original finishes using some Forby's buildup remover and some triple alt synthetic steel wool. Then you lightly sand it with 320, then with 600 grit sandpaper. Clean it again with that stuff. Let it sit a few days to kind of get all the evaporation out of it. Then use a multi-coat tongue oil that has been mixed with lighter fluid. In other words, you got to get this stuff thin enough that it absorbs into the veneer. And then what you do is you put a coat on it and let it sit. The lighter fluid will evaporate, the tungsten will say. You do that over and over and over, 12 to 15 coats over a few day period. Something I've always done is I pulled the metal sub chassis frame because they're typically all scratched up from people putting the platter on them. And I get those powder coated black, and then I typically polish the lid with a Nova 7100 3-step plastic kit. And just a couple other mods I have seen done. Those were the ones I went through were typical. There are all sorts of motor replacements out there, some that even come with external speed controllers, so you don't have to lift the platter to switch between 33 and 45. Company Sound of the Woods makes these. Vinyl Nirvana has some. There was the Mohs Hercules, and I've used the Mohs Hercules before. It uses the factory motor. A little bit finicky, wasn't my favorite. I ended up selling it. Some guys have made some replacement sub chassis. I showed you that the Merrill outer locking ring. I've seen replacement wood plinths for these things, that solid wood plinths people have made, and so on and so forth. There are lots of mods out there for these things. I just thought I'd show you. Here's an original brochure for an AR turntable. It kind of talks about the return of the legend. Kind of goes through a few of the specs here on these things. Here is a article from 1983 where it won a Design and Engineering Award at the International Consumer Electronics Show. Goes into a good bit of detail there. Here's stereo review from January 1984. High Fidelity did some stuff December 83. Hi-Fi News, so that's what's leading me to believe these things were actually out in 83. Actual manual itself, it kind of goes through and tells you how to unpack this thing. Oh yeah, by the way, these things have a locking shipping bolt right here. If you ever want to ship one of these, please use it. It talks a little bit about the tone arm, the pivot, the overhang, etc. The arm board and how to route the cables and whatnot. But shows you how the belt should ride in the middle here of this thing. Shows you how to turn your platter upside down on this thing to kind of check whether your belt's riding properly, etc. Nice little manual here that comes from the factory. And so let's go jump on the bench and take a look at one here at the house. Okay, here's the lovely AR turntable you can see here. It's got a hinged lid on it that once open holds it on. If you'll notice in the back here, I told you I've added a third spring. No one would ever notice it, and it looks just about like factory here. I happen to be running a what I found was a cool Led Zeppelin 3 slip mat on it, but nothing fancy. It used to have a really nice cork and kind of weighted slip mat, but it got worn out. And you can kind of see here the outer platter that comes off here, and then you have the inner platter here. And this back here, let me move the camera a little bit, is where you would actually pick the belt up off, like I'm doing right here, and move it to the top. The top would be for 33 RPM, and the bottom would be for 45. So let's move this to 33 right here, and you can see the middle of this thing, how it's been, there's been weight added to this thing, and it's been balanced properly. This thing weights back down on here. When you put this on here, and then you drop onto it an LP, this thing is completely suspended at this point. You see how my hand's kind of floating around right here? Well, if you have the turntable sitting still and then you move the outer platter or shake the desk or whatever, all the rest of it, this floating suspension here stays perfectly still. So the goal is with the Lens springs I talked about earlier, to have this thing so that it's halfway between its full up and its full down when you have 180 LP on this thing. You can see here we've replaced the arm board on this thing. This is a lacewood arm board, and then you can see here the Lens Basic Plus tone arm that's been put onto this thing, and it's just a really slick looking tone arm, straight arm, and I happen to be running an Ortofon 2M Black on this thing, and cueing mechanism, everything works really well on this thing. I'm really happy with how it does. You can see nice glossy finish on this thing. This one's more along the kind of lighter color one than either the dark walnut or the cherry one. If I can get into the other room over there in a little bit, I'll show you a kind of cherry colored one that I have. You can see here with the outer platter off that the inner platter here kind of floats and spins, and it'll lift up and out of the bearing wheel. And then this is the upper part of the subframe chassis. This is kind of the platter mount here, and then the sub chassis springs all mount to this platter, and then this whole, as you can see, this and the arm here kind of float together on this floating sub suspension. I'm going to take this thing into the other room. I was going to show you how to take the lid off. You just kind of spring it all the way back, and then you lift this thing. It just slides into those into the little hinge brackets right here that go back and forth, and kind of get that out of the way. I've got this thing in here on the bench. I'm going to take the belt off of it, and as you can kind of see here on this thing, it's kind of whitish. Keep talc on that thing. At that point, then the bladder inner platter pops straight out. This thing's got a little ball mounted bottom here into the, kind of pressed into the bottom, so you want to make sure that thing's spinning freely. By the way, I always use synthetic motor oil, 0 weight on these things. And then you can see here the actual bearing wheel, and I've got this thing apart, I'll probably clean it out or whatnot, but you can see the talc here, my talc ring from the use of that on the table here. But you can kind of see this thing kind of, floats below here, and how all that arm is kind of mounted to it at the same time. I know it's making a little bit of noise because I'm moving it a pretty good bit. If you have to think about it, this thing would just be moving just maybe a millimeter or two with the actual LP on it, and vibrations in the room or whatnot. But let's put this thing upside down and see what's underneath. Okay, as you can see, I always like to use some 2x4s or something underneath a table like this to kind of hold it up, because you would not want to have it resting on your tone arm. But as you can see, these are just kind of stick weight magnets that they use for tires, for weighting on tires. So you can get a huge box of these, like 15 pounds of them, pretty darn cheap, to be honest. And then this is just an extra piece of weight here that was added on there. If I'm not mistaken, this table may have been done by Mark Moran, because that looks like one of the weights I've seen him use before. But you can see the Lin Black springs here with the new rubber grommets on them, and you always want to make sure your rubber grommets are kind of fresh and not getting hard and brittle. And you can see the bottom of the bearing well here. You can see the, in this case, the Hurst motor in this thing, which ultimately feeds over here inside of this, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But you can see here I am running a set of Mangami tone arm cables, and these things come over here, and if you'll notice it's on a 90-degree angle, and it's made to just push right into the bottom of this table. And you always want to make sure when you mount this thing, the tone arm cable here, that it's not binding in any way, either twisting this thing one way or the other, or that it would prohibit this thing from moving up or down freely. This one then has a ground cable here that comes over and kind of grounds to the chassis here, and you can see how the 3 bolts here that hold the arm board onto this thing, and then you can see the actual turntable tone arm mounts to that arm board. And so it's really about, like I said, weighting this sub chassis properly to get this thing balanced, and at the same time adjusting, because these as you turn these adjust the tension on these springs, but getting the whole thing properly suspended about anywhere from halfway to about 70% with a kind of 140 to 180 gram LP on this thing. And as I lift this cover up here, you can kind of see in here, it's just a simple circuit board, 3 wires that go to the motor, and then 2 that go out to the power cord, and then 2 that come up here to the switch on the very front that's mounted right here. And I've replaced this 0.22 microfarad, but this looks like the original kind of run capacitor there on this thing, the 0.25 microfarad. I might replace that while I've got this thing apart as well. If anybody's interested in a set of these cables, because I use these Mangami cables on a lot of different turntables, the guy that builds these things in Greece, and he does an amazing job on them. Shipping's a little bit expensive, you know, in the $20 range, but the cables themselves are not bad. I think the set for this is about $89 with shipping or whatnot, and the guy will make them whatever length you want, and he'll put whether you want the ground wire on both ends. You can pick what kind of lug you want on your ground wire there on the other end. So the guy's really flexible in what he does. As you can see here, this thing has what I mentioned, a particle board or press board, but it's super dense. I mean, super dense press board. And then you can just kind of see here how it's covered in the veneer all the way up to the edge here on it. So I think you get the general gist of it. And one other thing I had done to this table, it used to be a guy, I haven't seen him on there in a while, but on Audio Karma, called Big Bill. He's actually here in Charlotte, not far up the road from me, but I sent this tone arm to him at one point in time, and he redid the bearings in this thing. I can't remember whether they were sapphire or ruby bearings that he put into this tone arm, but really nice tone arm. One of the downsides, the reason I've not modded many of these recently, these Lin tone arms are getting extremely hard to find. I paid $125 for this one. The last one I saw sold for $375. And the tables themselves, I paid $200 for this table, and typically now they're anywhere from $400 to $600 to $700 for the basic table. And then you'll end up you know, with another $75 in an exotic arm board here, some weights, some time and labor, new cables, whatnot. It's easy these days to end up with $1,000 in this table when you're all said and done, and you know, without your cartridge, it's $600 cartridge there. But you know, back in the day, you could do one and have it all done for about $400 to $500, and you know, then you had a table that would keep up with you know, tables of a whole lot more value. So you know, they're the desire to mod these is probably getting less because there's a lot of money involved in it now, as well as they're just getting darn scarcer and harder to find. Alright, putting this thing back together, I cleaned this out with some Q-tips. I've put some oil in it. You don't put a lot because this bearing seals extremely tight going down the well, or the shaft here, and it's extremely hard to get it to push down. Sometimes you just have to let it sit, and it'll take an hour or two to go all the way down. And earlier I said there's a bearing in here. It's not. It's actually just pressed as part of the, or machined as part of the metal. Kind of had that confused with the Thorin's 124. But, you know, put a little bit of oil down in there, 2-3 drops, a little bit on the spindle here, and kind of, you know, work it around lightly across this thing. And then you kind of drop that thing back down in there like that. But hey, this isn't a restoration video. It is a it's a gear review. So, all right, review wise, I'm giving this thing like a solid 9 out of 10 thumbs up. Really love these tables, and I think if you own one, you would too. Not saying there's not better tables out there. I'm just saying, for the money and the looks of these things, I think they're top notch. So I'm going to wrap up the review here at this point.